Good afternoon again to everybody. I want to thank Professor Martinez, Evaristo Martinez Radio for having put up this meeting. And of course, I want to thank all the team of CITCEM, Joana Sequeira, Inês Ravanda, and João for all the work they are having and all the work they had in putting this so that we can be here sharing our experiences. I'm going to speak about Portuguese, the prisoners of war in Portugal during the Napoleonic Wars. And I must say before I start that I was quite interested in Professor Alexander's presentation when he told that, at least I knew what happened to 35 Portuguese that were taken or that were obliged to fight in the Napoleonic armies by Junot after the first invasion in 1807. And so these, in fact, they are long lost prisoners, as you say, because we don't know much about what happened to these Portuguese. Some returned, the others we don't know. So I found out what happened to 35 of them, and I'm glad to know that they were well treated in St. Petersburg. Okay, so let's start with my paper. In this paper, I'm going to call attention to a theme not much studied in Portugal. I know that if for you this is not new, but in Portugal it is something that's not widely studied. The prisoners of war, or in the English abbreviation POWs, of course there are some studies for the 20th century, but not too many for former epochs. In my opinion, as this study was not yet done, it is important to rescue from oblivion, the thousands of men and women deprived of liberty, abused and tortured, which the only crime is to have fought for their country or their ideals. Nowadays, international historiography shows an increasing interest in this topic, and it is an interesting perspective for the study of the changes in the character of war, principally in the assumption of the legal framework. Of course, this can be a sensitive issue, as being a prisoner of war is not a very honorable thing. So many of the protagonists, either for shame or for wanting to forget what they had to endure in captivity, decide not to speak about it in order to throw silence in this episode of their lives. At the same time, accordingly with Portuguese historian Pedro Aires de Oliveira, the so-called new military history, with the idea of the history from below, try to show how the analysis of the experiments of groups exterior to the elites and the use of sources that have been neglected could give us a more diversified panorama. And in fact, in the case of Portugal, I must say that a lot of research has to be made in the archives in order to find all this documentation. I know that where some is, but for the moment it is unreachable because of the situation we are living in. First, I would like to address an interesting, as I think it's quite an important point, prisoners. What is a prisoner of war? It's a difficult classification. Vasco Silva, a Portuguese author who wrote a book about prisoners of war in the Middle Ages, draw the attention to the fact that in this epoch, I mean the Middle Ages, there existed prisoners of ordinary crimes, prisoners for having disobeyed military orders, prisoners of war, and indirect war prisoners. Of course, I think this classification can still be used nowadays. Of course, we must also nowadays add to this enumeration the political prisoners. Although I'm not going to speak here how the concept of prisoner of war evolved, I must say that in my opinion, this is a question worth discussing. What is a POW? I mean, it's not exactly the same for the 21st century, 20th century, 18th century, 17th century. For the moment, I shall consider a prisoner of war accordingly to the definition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, using the authority of the Encyclopedia Britannica, who says that a prisoner of war is any person captured or interned by a belligerent power during war. In the strictest sense, it is applied only to members of regularly organized armed forces. But the broader definition is that also included guerrilla, civilians who take up arms against an enemy openly, and non-combatants associated with the military force. The Portuguese historian I already quoted, Pedro Aires de Oliveira, writes that it was in the second half of the 16th century when the most important measures were taken for the creation of an international system of protection for POWs. During the war of the French Revolution and of Napoleon, the destiny reserved to the prisoners of war depended on national practices. For instance, by the 5th May 1792, a decree of the French Legislative Assembly put the prisoners under the protection of nation and law. At the same time, the regulation of 20th of June created a juridical framework that established rules for the reception and confinement. In the following years, this legislation was completed, giving rise to an official status of prisoner of war. Now, as I said, I'm going to speak about the French prisoners in Portugal during the Peninsular War. Speaking now about the Peninsular War, Portuguese historiography calls Napoleonic intervention in Portugal from 1807 to 1811-12 as French invasions. Obviously, during this conflict, several French soldiers that participated in the offensive were imprisoned. Well, on the other hand, the Portuguese army had 6,609 men considered as lost and prisoners. Among these military, we have 1,156 officials and 6,500 privates. Besides, around 229 horses were captured, and horses being quite an important war machine, if you want to call them like that, it's also put in the documents. In what regards the conditions of imprisonment of French soldiers in Portugal during the Peninsular War, it seems that the places of confinement varied from epoch to epoch and accordingly with the military hierarchy of the captives. We can have a glimpse of what I'm saying in a letter written by General Messager dated 2nd May 1810. In this message, the prisoners in the fort of Santiago de Outão in Setúbal, that's a city located in northern bank of the Sado River estuary, approximately 40 kilometers or 30 miles south of Lisbon. So this General Messager thanked Marshal Beresford for allowing French prisoners to have access to newspapers and to have a swim at sea near the fort. It seems that the fort commander made objections to this special treatment as he had no instructions about these privileges. Therefore, General Messager addresses again Beresford, asking him to give orders so that the detained could enjoy the privileges given. Nonetheless, not all the French prisoners had the same luck. Some went to work for the big landowners, as the wages of the Portuguese workers were very high, and those of the captured French much lower. Some municipalities launched taxes over the rural wages, reason why the rural workers abandoned their posts. Therefore, the lack of laborers justified the request sent to the Chief of Police of Lisbon to force all the unoccupied men to work in agriculture. As about 700 men were available in Lisbon, it was necessary to have them in the fields as soon as possible, since the moment they arrived, the wages would diminish as the workers would take sense. The landowner that benefited more from this was a certain José Manuel de Lima, the largest estate owner of Santarém, a city also not far from Lisbon, although he needed 300 permanent laborers and between 125 to 150 daily workers for farming all this estate, he was only able to obtain 80 men accompanied by their respective wardens, as other prisoners had been already recruited to work in other large states. The Count of Lausanne, another big landowner, asked for 30 men. Two other ladies from the aristocracy also requested prisoner labor force. One needed 10 men and the other one 8. All these captured French soldiers should be accompanied and guarded by low-rank officials or privates appointed by the Sergeant Mor. That's an important military authority in Portugal. I must say that all these requests were fulfilled. Even today, I think it is acceptable to ask a prisoner of war to work, but nowadays, under the legal laws of work, and they have the right to be paid. Other prisoners were not so lucky. Many of them were kept in very bad conditions and lodged in very unhealthy places. Some of them were incarcerated in pontoons, that is, obsolete, captured or damaged ships were used as prisons, and as one can guess, conditions were appalling. The Portuguese used two frigates, Venus and Amazona, as well as a vessel called Princesa da Beira that were moored in the Tagus River in Lisbon. A former French officer, A. de Ilan, who had fought in Portugal and Spain, published in 1841 a book called Souvenir du Portugal, Souvenir militaire du temps de l'Empire par un officier du 10e corps, where he testifies the horrors of the war and how the people of the Iberian Peninsula treated with great cruelty all the enemies they managed to capture. Although he is a Frenchman, he says that it is only fair to state that in both Spain and Portugal, the British managed to tear or snatch from the fury of an exasperated people all the French prisoners they could and put them under their protection. However, the same officer states that their luck changed when they arrived in the UK, where they were subjected to the cruelest tortures. In the course of 1809, a second invasion, the first invasion of Portugal by French troops took place between 1807 and 1808, and now the second invasion took place in 1809. This time, the occupation army was commanded Marshal Soult, Duke of Dalmatia, and the northwest Portugal was specially attained. The military operations and the forced lodging of troops were a great burden to civilians. Of course, you have already said that that is in other places, like in France, it is always a great burden to civilians. Although it's interesting to point out that although in Portugal the French culture enjoyed a wide appreciation, when we read all the documents from this epoch, I don't think the French are so appreciated. The British are more appreciated because they came us to deliver from that monster Napoleon. But of course, once the wars were over, we went back to admire and study French culture, literature, theater, etc., etc. As I meant, Soult entered Portugal, and one priest contemporary of these events wrote a diary in which he speaks about atrocities committed by the French on their way to Porto. They entered from the north, from the city of Chaves, Braga, and arrived to Porto. I'm sorry, I'm doing quite a traditional paper without maps, but I didn't know very much how to do, because this is the first time I'm doing a paper through internet. So, as I said, the atrocities committed by this priest speaks about the atrocities committed by the French on their way to Porto, and says this exasperated each time more the population, who ambushed and killed the soldiers. He also alludes to the deaths caused by this war, having died besides the civilians many priests and monks who took up arms against the invaders. In fact, if we are to believe in what Pierre Lenoble, a French officer who took part in this campaign, wrote in his memoir about how the inhabitants were forced to take up arms at the approach of Soult's army, menaces or arrests were used by the Portuguese authorities to obtain cooperation, and the most reluctant were massacred. It seems also that the consuls of Denmark, Holland, Prussia, and Russia were forced to serve on the Porto batteries to help to defend the city. Soult arrived near Porto better, on the 26th March 1809 and started the attack on the 29th at 8 a.m. It was this day that one of the biggest disasters in city's history happened. The bridge of boats built with vessels put side by side that linked Porto to southern shore, I mean to Vila Nova de Gaia, collapsed under the weight of the enormous quantity of people fleeing the city. Many persons drowned in the river. After this, Porto was thoroughly sacked. As Sir Charles Oman writes in his History of the Peninsular War, Soult had conquered the city and had delivered some French captives, but was far from having completed the conquest of northern Portugal, as on the day he first crossed its frontier. He had only secured for himself a new base of operations to supersede Chaves and Braga. His main goal, however, the capture of Lisbon, never occurred, because they managed to cross the river, but they just entered a kilometers or miles south without even reaching the middle of the country. Colonel Napier, an eyewitness of the war in the peninsula, also speaks about the conciliatory police of Marshal Soult, endeavoring to remedy the situation, to remedy soldiers' fury. Recovering and restoring a part of the plunder, he caused the inhabitants remaining in the town to be treated with respect and invited by proclamation all those who had fled to return. He demanded no contribution and, restraining with a firm hand the violence of his men, contrived from the captured public property to support the army and even to succor the poorest and most distressed of the population. At the same time, it seems that there was an amelioration of relations between the army and the peasantry. French soldiers were no longer murdered, and even the priests were not so hostile. It is interesting to note this defense of Soult made by a British officer. He even criticized Portuguese ferocity when he speaks about the death of Colonel Lamé and the consequent retaliation. In fact, this young officer was ambushed and murdered near the village of Arifana, his body being stripped and mutilated in a shocking manner. This, in Napier's point of view, was justifiable. Neither by the laws of war nor by those of humanity, and he concluded that no general could neglect to punish such a proceeding. As a consequence, Soult decided to punish the culprits and sent with that purpose to Arifana General Tomier, accompanied by a Portuguese civilian. After judicial inquiry, 5 or 6 persons considered guilty were killed. It seems, however, that the real individual responsible, a major of militia, together with some companions, managed to escape. As Ad Ilam, this officer spoke about that I said that fought in the peninsula, wrote that his comrades were so aroused with indignation that decided to make no more prisoners, which in fact mean just kill all the Portuguese they captured. Now there is a particular case, the case of Thérèse Figueur, a French prisoner. We know the adventures of this woman in Portugal, disguised as a French officer, through a book written by Saint-Germain-le-Duc entitled Les campagnes de Mademoiselle Thérèse Figueur, aujourd'hui Madame Veuve Sutter, extra grand au 15e et 9e régiment de 1793 à 1815, écrite sous sa dictée, published in Paris in 1842. This woman was captured near Burgos in Spain by a party of guerrillas commanded by a famous Spanish priest, the cura Merino. The Spanish treated her very well, and she has been very charitable with them. But instead of accepting the offer to be sent to France, cura Merino even proposed to accompany her to France. She preferred to be delivered to the British troops. She said she wanted to see England. After this, she was imprisoned in a farm together with other Frenchmen, to which were subsequently added other prisoners. This first imprisonment, of course, was in Spain. So when there was enough people in this farm, she made part of a column of 200 persons, and accompanied by Scottish soldiers, she started her journey to Lisbon. In a forest, that she cannot precise where it was. I mean, she says it was in a forest, but she cannot tell us which place in Portugal or Spain it was. The courteous Scottish, which she finds Scottish are courteous to the prisoners and very humanitarian to the prisoners, handed them to the Portuguese. Then started a nightmare, as the Portuguese treated very badly the French as if they were dogs, as she puts it. Fatigue and dysentery killed 2/3 of the French prisoners, so that when they reached Abrantes, a city already in Portuguese territory, well inside Portuguese territory, in the margins of the Tagus River, there were only 61 people. In this place, they were embarked so they could continue their voyage by boat. They were helped to be condemned to the galleys, as they shared with them bread and onions. Although it may seem strange, there was still men condemned to the galleys in the Tagus River at this time of its epoch. When they arrived in Lisbon, the people received them with great hostilities, throwing stones at them. After this incident, and I think for the first time, Thérèse Figueira realized how much the Portuguese had suffered under Junot's invasion. As no one had until now discovered that she was not a man, and certainly not an officer, but a woman in disguise, she was incarcerated in a fort and not in the pontoons moored in the Tagus. Although her situation was better than that of other prisoners, she complains bitterly about the bad conditions and the ill treatment she and the other prisoners suffered. She complains that she has to sleep on the floor, that the floor had no rugs. It was cold stone. They didn't have enough water to cook. They didn't have the proper the proper things to eat and to cook. And well, she complains a lot about their situation, and she says she tries to comfort all the Frenchmen that were missing their families. Of course, it's quite curious is that until now, no one ever found that she was a woman. Of course, I'm lucky to see a book that appeared recently in France called Madame Sans-Gêne, which speaks about this lady, but I didn't have yet the opportunity to have it and read it. However, from where she was confined, she could see the rough and inhuman conditions in which the men incarcerated in prison ship in the pontoons led it. They were forced to work under any conditions of weather, cold or sun, or heavy sun, so it was very, very conditions, and she was sorry for them. In Lisbon, widely in prison, she made the acquaintance of an Italian opera singer. In fact, the main voice of the Opera of Lisbon had good connections with influential people and became a protector. It seems that, and I see now from what you said in the other papers, that it is not unusual. The Portuguese they were incarcerated, the French were incarcerated in the fort, and the Portuguese could see the prisoners. There was a quay along the river, and they could walk. And so this lady went to look at the prisoners, and so she said afterwards that the main idea was that she wanted to have news of her brother that was serving under Napoleon. So they became good friends. And so after this meeting, Thérèse Figueira no longer needed her disguise. She was acquainted as a woman, and her life in Lisbon became more bearable, more comfortable, and even she was authorized to visit the opera singer's house, even to attend parties that this singer threw in her house. Besides all this, the governor of Lisbon was a French émigré with whom Thérèse had an interview after an incident involved one of her guardians. The governor obliged her to renounce to dress like a man and dress like a woman, even also because the British did not allow that if a female that a female would dress in men's clothes. So it seems that for Thérèse, this was a very good. This was very good because although she and the governor have different political positions, we must not forget that if the governor was an immigré, he was in favor of the Ancien Regime, and Thérèse was a product of the revolution and of Napoleonic times. So a fortnight after this incident and a fortnight after meeting the governor, she obtained authorization to travel to England together with other French prisoners. She stayed for a while in Britain and finally returned to France in 1814. Although some of the people of the French complained that they were very well treated by the British in the Iberian Peninsula and badly in Great Britain, she doesn't say anything about the way she was treated while she was in the UK. Well, just before I finish, I like to draw once again the attention to the importance of the study of the POWs for periods before the 20th century. As this subject, as about this subject, we don't have much information. And I stress, in the Portuguese case, we have some studies for the 21st century, mainly for the First World War, as we entered the First War on side of the Allies, and even someone wrote about the 200 or 300 Portuguese that were imprisoned in the Nazi camps. So, but before, and I mean, Portugal is not like Spain. During the 18th century, we were allied of Great Britain, so we cannot find Portuguese prisoners of war in Britain. And with France, we had a good relationship. But I know that there are a lot of documents about this in the Portuguese archives, mainly in Lisbon, in the Arquivo Militar, I mean the military archive, in the archive of the Marine, as well as in national archives. Unfortunately, since March, I was not able to travel to Lisbon because of the coronavirus. And fortunately, some of these documents I used are already available in the internet, and also these books with these memoirs, many of them are also available in the internet. So just to finish, I don't want to bother you any longer. It seems, however, that the testimonies I used are true, as General Arthur Wellesley, the future Duke of Wellington, in the proclamation to the inhabitants of Porto in 1809, he entered Porto and released, and the French went away on the 12th May 1809, asked the people of the city to take no revenge upon the French soldiers left behind, because they were ill and hospitalized in the city's health institutions. So if the Duke of Wellington says so, it's because he was afraid of the revenge of the Portuguese using the French that were left behind. So I thank you all, and I hope this was of some use to you, and sorry for not using the new technologies. Thank you very much to everybody.